Shame on U.S. is the title of the report by the University of San Diego's Children's Advocacy Institute. The report reveals child welfare laws are not being appropriately enforced by all three government branches, which puts abused and neglected children at further risk of harm. Joining me with details on how to fix this problem is my guest, Christina Reel, Senior Staff Attorney with the Children's Advocacy Institute. And Christina, was there a particular case or trend that got your institute and your group interested in doing this report?
Well, yes, we were looking at outcomes and what was happening to kids in care, and we saw that there were a lot of cases that had been brought to really help kids in care across the state and across the country. And then we started noticing that it was the same issues being brought up again and again, and so we wanted to look a little deeper. Why is that? We do have these federal requirements in place. Why aren't states meeting those standards?
Highlight some of the key concerns and issues that you found were trends.
We were really concerned with social workers not visiting children regularly, with children not having attorneys when they should have attorneys, and kids that were moving from place to place and hadn't found that stable family home for them to live in.
Were you able to find or have some examples of how this actually impacted or affected the children that either didn't have the attorneys or that were being kind of lost?
Well, one issue that happens here in San Diego is that when children act out in a group home, they might end up going to juvenile hall, and they bounce around between juvenile hall and Polinsky because there's no family willing to take these kids back in. When had maybe whatever they did, maybe they threw a shoe across the room. Well, that's assault, could be assault with a deadly weapon in foster care. But if that had happened in their family's home, it really would have been nothing but, hey, go to your room for a bit.
So there are laws in California and, of course, in every single state that are child protection laws. What's supposed to happen if those aren't in compliance, if a social worker isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing?
If states aren't meeting their standards, for example, social workers aren't going out as often as they should, then the federal government is supposed to be withholding funds from the state until the state can come into compliance.
Child welfare agencies have a long history of saying, listen, we're underfunded, we're understaffed, we don't have enough flexibility on how we can use the money that we do get. What's your take on these issues?
We actually agree with them. And so our position isn't, hey, federal government, we want you to cut off all federal funding. But if you're not making the threats, then the local county and state agencies aren't going to find these children as their priority population and properly fund them. So we think that the threat of withdrawing federal funding needs to be the appropriate hammer to get states and counties to properly prioritize these children so that they won't lose the federal funding that's available.
And that makes sense. There's a consequence, but what about getting more funding if they indeed are underfunded?
We think that if there was a real threat at the federal level, then they would get more funding within the county and state budgets. There are funds out there. It's just a matter of where those funds go, and these children aren't necessarily the popular place to place those funds.
What happens to kids who fall through the cracks? I know you mentioned juvenile hall. Were you able to find the data on that? Do they trickle out of the system? What happens?
Well, kids who fall through the cracks it happens all over the place. We have kids that aren't attaining their high school education. They're not graduating from college at near the rate of the average population. These children lose ties to their families. One of these federal requirements is that family ties are maintained and family continuity. These kids have no family safety net, they have no longevity in placement, and they end up really lost as they're exiting.
Well, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services hasn't commented on this report. Has anybody else commented, or are you getting reactions?
We're getting reactions from other advocates, mostly very supportive and saying we see that this is happening, we know it's a problem, and we're glad someone is finally saying something and calling out the issues that these kids are neglected at every level.
You also brought this report to some staff members of Congress. What would you like to see happen next?
We would like to see some changes in the laws. We'd like to see some timelines put in, some requirements that Health and Human Services actually act within an appropriate amount of time, and that if Health and Human Services doesn't act, we would like to see a private right of enforcement inserted so that private citizens can say, we see these children being neglected, or I as a child have been neglected, and I want to require that my state meet the federal standards in order to receive these federal funds.
All right, Christina Reel, thanks so much for the update.
Thanks so much for having me.